My name is Jason S. Fong, the host of Vanilla Club Podcast. Today's episode explores something most of us take for granted, and that's language. Our guest is Kella Narki Merlain-Moffatt, who is Associate Director of the Africana Center at Tufts. Go Jumbos, by the way, where she is responsible for developing programs that uplift students of African descent. I came across Kella's work through a study that she published in 2024 entitled In Conversation, Mother Tongue Education and Civic Engagement Amongst Ga Youth. On a trip to Ghana in 2022, Kella interviewed several Ga people to find that despite Ghanaian policy encouraging mother tongue instruction, most participants learned in English during their schooling, which now actually, to a large degree, influences how they approach the world around them. All of this reminds me of a Lee Kuan Yew quotation that language transmits values. Kella's research provides insight into how linguistic accessibility might increase civic engagement. And this conversation reminds us of the profound role that language plays in shaping both personal identity and human relations as a whole. We hope you enjoy. This is the Vanilla Club Podcast. My name's Jason S. Fong. We are lay persons. We are vanilla growers in North Queensland. We're trying to keep it simple, but at the same time, the world is a complex place. And this podcast series is about trying to get comfortable with complexity. That's the basic premise. So we like to engage with a lot of different guests with lots of different domain expertise in areas that we don't know very much about. We sometimes know very little about. But at the same time, I think that responsible citizenship entails sometimes opening your mind, extending to people with a lot more knowledge, and engaging in hopefully good conversation. So with that, I'd like to welcome Kella Narki Merlain-Moffatt, Associate Director of the Africana Center at Tufts. You have a bachelor at Tufts. You've got a master's degree at Columbia. You are, all over implementation of leadership programs at the university, uplifting students of African descent. And I was really interested in your personal intellectual interest in sort of linguistic accessibility, and how that ties in even with like civic engagement and stuff like that. Yeah, so maybe we can just, learn a little bit about your background and being of Ghanaian-Haitian descent, living in Boston, Somerville, Medford, if that's the case at Tufts. Tell us a little bit about your background and, the ability that you've had, the fortune that you've had to be connected back to Ghana. And, it's something you've talked about is the ability, that you've had to travel back and visit.
Fair. Well, thank you for having me this evening. I do want to say that everything I say is my personal opinion, none of the university's. Yes, I guess to jump in, I grew up in a multilingual household. And, I think as a kid, you don't necessarily put too much stock in that. But I think I am super grateful for that experience because it's just been able to broaden my horizons and has helped me to connect with people in new ways that I would have never imagined. And I think has really given me a platform to take steps that otherwise I perhaps wouldn't have. And so, like you were saying, I am of Haitian and Ghanaian descent. And so I was really fortunate to have parents who have thought it to be very important to ensure that their children are connected to their culture, connected to their roots, and know where they come from. And so I've been able to visit both places since I was a kid. And one of the reasons I actually chose Tufts for my undergrad was because they did have a study abroad program to Ghana. And so in doing that program, it really gave me an opportunity to make friends who are my own age and to start meeting people and having different conversations. And it was really an opportunity for me to just get to know Ghana for myself for the first time. I had done a summer program at one of the universities when I was a junior in high school, but we were just on campus. We didn't go out too much. And so that was a really formative time to get to know people who are my age. But I'd say when I was studying abroad in college, it really gave me an opportunity to explore and to get to know the place for myself. And so my family now has this running joke that every time I get to Ghana, I kind of land and say, okay, guys, well, I have breakfast now with someone. I have lunch. I have this. And I'm out the door and I'm doing my own thing. And so I'm really happy that I have that experience now. When I was in my master's program at Columbia, I really wanted to understand the intersections of language and civic engagement. And I guess to backtrack, when I was at Tufts, my senior year, my thesis was on the intersections or the inclusionary and exclusionary boundaries of Latinidad. And I wanted to do that because I remember someone told me that I wasn't able to participate in the Latinx soul ceremony at that time because I wasn't Latina. And I thought that was so fascinating. I said, oh, I realize you don't know anything about the history of Haiti and the region and
Oh,
what
wow.
words really mean at the end of the day. And so that led me to going on this whole academic research journey of really understanding how is it that people are understanding what it means to be a part of a community, and also understanding how does language play into that. And so that's what I did when I was in undergrad. And so when I got to grad school, I really love, delving into both sides of my identity. And so I wanted to focus on Ghana this time around. And so that's how I thought about looking at language and civic engagement, because language policy was really fascinating to me in the classes that I was taking. And then civic engagement has been something that I've been really looking at for quite some time, because even when I was at Tufts, I was also a Tisch Scholar, which is this program that is centered around civic engagement. And so through having these research interests, I was able to go back to Ghana in the summer of 2022 and really look at this intersection, particularly for the Ga ethnic group that is in Accra, which is also the ethnic group that I am a part of. And so it was really nice to be able to meet with people who were around my age, who were much older than me, and to understand what their experiences had been like when it came to language in the classroom, outside of the classroom, and how it really shaped them as individuals and also as community members. So, yeah.
Wow, that's a lovely survey. Thank you for that. Because again, there's so many different themes to pick up on. I mean, even if you think about, because it's the Ga language, is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, Ga.
And Ga, from just a very cursory sort of look into it, I mean, there's like many countries that maybe people from the States, people from sort of, highly developed countries don't necessarily know about or care to know that much about. There's a phenomenal amount of diversity, right? You've got the Twi, is that how you pronounce it? The Twi language, is that it would be they're the most speakers of that dialect, that language in Ghana, is that correct?
Yes, so that would be the lingua franca of the country, which is the language that people can utilize, say in business and trade, also to connect and communicate across groups and across different languages, but English is also a major language that is used.
Because again, I think the best place to start is really to probably talk about how big Africa is, right? Again, depending on the geographic projection that you use, I mean, the size of Africa is distorted, whereas, something like Greenland is distorted, upwards. Africa tends to be distorted downwards in size. I mean, it's a massive continent, right? And there's dozens of countries with an enormous amount of human diversity. The flora and fauna are vastly different. You've got a huge desert. I mean, There's North Africa, which is almost probably pretty foreign to somebody who's living in Central African Republic or Zambia maybe. But at the same time, it's also a continent where there's a lot of different things happening. There's significant population growth happening across. There's a youth bulge, in many cases, and it's a continent that, I don't know, it seems like a lot of people who don't necessarily have a connection to don't know very much about. But there's so much there, right? There's so much there, and I think, Ghana. There's like 35 million people in Ghana. I mean, that's big. I mean, like Massachusetts is like 6 million or 7 million, right? I mean, it puts things into context. That is, the state of California is about 45, 50. So it's almost that size and scale of country. It's West African, right? So again, there's a lot of cultural similarities with the Yoruba. It crosses over into maybe some of the like Nigerian culture to some extent, right? Again, these borders that we have between countries are somewhat artificial, presumably, that there's kinship and ethno-linguistic connections that really supersede a lot of these land borders that we come to know if we're looking at a political map.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I think that, especially considering how large the continent is, it really goes to show how much there is to learn from the continent at the end of the day. I think people don't recognize, like you're saying, that it's so vast. There's a country in the continent where it snows, and people don't know that. I think people often might of the desert. There are places where it can feel a bit more tropical, and so there's just so much diversity just in the biology of the place. But then I think too, when it comes to the language, the people, the interests, it's so vast and there's so much opportunity, so much growth. I think it'll be really interesting to see over the next few decades how the continent really expands and grows as we see that there are new political shifts happening on the continent each day.
So when we talk about linguistic accessibility and your intellectual interest in this subject, it seems like it makes sense for business and trade to use English medium. There's a lot of political will behind English medium language instruction, or maybe in other parts, there's a lot of French speakers. There's Portuguese speakers in Africa. There's a lot. So give us a little snapshot of what the tension is, right? It's, on one hand, you have people advocating for a more kind of universalist kind of English medium, and then other people are looking to some of the other topics that you touch on, right, in some of your research, regarding like civic engagement, regarding sort of this idea of, I guess, language transmitting values in a way. Give us a snapshot of what the tension is.
Sure. So I think the simplest way that I like to break this down for folks is, imagine what it would be like to go to school and not understand anything that your teacher is saying to you. How would you learn? How would you digest the information? How would you be able to participate in your classroom and beyond? What does it look like for you to get homework and to go home and no one can help you with it because nobody understands what it says? How then are you supposed to engage in society? How are you supposed to use schooling as a tool to social mobility? How are you supposed to advance and really use it as a way in which for you to learn and experience and to grow? I think it stimulates that at the end of the day. I think when it comes to the tension, yes, you do have people who are advocates for mother tongue education. You have folks who are also advocates for English or French or Portuguese, Spanish, etc., using those languages to be the medium of instruction. And I think even when I was conducting my research, I found some people who did say that if you are learning in your first language, yes, it's great, but how does that help when I leave the country? How does that help with my job prospects? And a question I like to pose is, well, what would it look like if you didn't have to leave the country for the job that you want because you can speak in the language that you know? What does it look like for you to be able to go into a job interview and you have your entire job interview in Ga, in Tree, and that's respected? It's not seen as, oh, why are you doing that? And I think too, people sometimes have this understanding that these colonial languages are really important. And I think they have their importance because we as people give it to them. But at the end of the day, that importance can be shifted to another language. And it's really critical because when students are not learning in the language that they speak at home or a language they really understand, that is where you're going to see people dropping out. You're going to see people repeating classes. You're going to see that the student is always the class clown. They don't take class seriously. But that's not the case. They just don't understand. And so, how are we ensuring that schooling is very accessible and is something that all students can partake in an equitable manner so that they are able to advance and really grasp the information? And one of the scholars that I quote, or I cite, I should say, they talk about this idea of how if you're going to be learning civic engagement in particular, your civic education has to be something, has to be in a language that you understand. And there are plenty of folks who talk about this notion that if you're not understanding in a language that is close to you, how is it that you're able to really enact change moving forward? And so I think especially when it comes to civic engagement, it's critical for people to be able to have those experiences of learning in their home language. But of course, the tension still exists. I believe, across the continent right now, we're seeing some shifts. We're seeing some countries say that we're not going to be teaching, the media of instruction will not be this colonial language. Instead, it's going to be our indigenous languages. I think that's a real opportunity for Africa to rise as a whole, but it's also an opportunity on the individual level for people to have those opportunities to advance. And I think too, sometimes people can get stuck in the notion of, I didn't learn in my first language, but I'm fine. I made it through, everything was good. But sometimes too, we don't think about what are the different factors that you had that supported that. And also too, was there a point in time in which you struggled? And what did that struggle look like for you? And why is it that someone else has to go through that experience as well when they don't have to? I think it's unfortunate that for some people in their indigenous languages, perhaps the only text they may have is a religious text, which is very beautiful. But I think too, there's a lot of beauty in being able to understand, say, physics in your home language, or being able to understand critically social studies, or whatever the case may be, but really having the language and the words in your language to be able to describe these phenomena that are occurring across the world and in your hometown.
Is it fair to say that by emphasizing civic engagement, that there may be some trade-off though? Well, no, but in terms of, I'm just trying to think about for somebody who's looking at this from like a trade point of view or a business point of view, would their argument be that, well, we're going to, if we emphasize the mother tongue instruction, our international links with other countries in the region or in Africa or beyond would be somewhat diminished if our level of communication were to drop, right? Is there some element of a zero something, or is the idea that you have higher mother tongue ability in addition to continuing to learn the colonial language and having facility in both of them?
I mean, I would argue that folks who are native speakers of colonial languages need to do a better job of learning other languages. The world cannot simply revolve around the colonists at the end of the day. And so I think there needs to be a more concerted effort. I think multilingualism within itself is something that is not encouraged as much, particularly in the United States, but something that does need to be encouraged more. And so I would say there's that. And I think too that advocating for mother tongue instruction is not advocating to never learn another language. It's simply giving students an opportunity to grasp concepts and theories in their language first. And there's this concept of linguistic interdependence, which shows that if you are learning in your first language, you have a good mastery of it, you're able to transfer those language learning skills to other languages that you're learning. And so you have this ability to know your language and learn a second and a third and a fourth with more success, because it's not as if you are struggling to understand your language and then now having to learn a new language or learn in a new language when you never really mastered those language skills in the first place, especially when it comes to, say, literacy in that language. And so there are studies that show that even if students are learning in their mother tongue, there have been multiple different programs where, say, maybe students are learning in their first language up until the fourth grade or the eighth grade, and then they switch to another language, or maybe in the fourth grade, they add on English or French or Spanish, whatever the case may be, and they continue. So I think there's definitely an opportunity and a world in which you can meld the two, and really have people learning in their indigenous languages and learning other languages as well. But I don't think I think if people continue to think this is, bad for trade, bad for the economy, nothing really changes. When I was interviewing the people I interviewed, one thing that they had spoken about is really this sense of language being tied to identity and their personhood. And so, yes, you can have people who make money, but at the end of the day, if we're all making money, but we have no sense of personhood, of identity, what exactly will this money do for us long term, outside of perhaps taking care of our basic necessities? Because I think community is greater than just the money that we're able to accumulate, that we're able to trade. And I think, too, I feel like I'm going all over the place. I think people forget that prior to colonization, people were multilingual. People conducted trade and they were very successful at it. And so I think there also needs to be a reframing of our understanding and our mindsets to know that these things are possible and that the status quo that we live in does not need to continue in order for life to be successful and fulfilling and to be rooted in the ways in which people would like to see themselves succeed and exist freely.
That's a great response. I think that it's a very heartening thought, right? Because you're talking about something that it's positive sum, it's enhancing. You learn a word in Spanish, you're somehow unlocking potentially a word in French, a word in Latin, maybe the base word, something in Italian or even Romanian, right? In that Romance family. And there are borrow words, there are cognates, there's, English is, it's to me, it's so wild when people, sort of think very conservatively, like, okay, we've got to speak English and we've got to do this. But English is a hybrid language itself. I mean, there's hundreds of German words, probably thousands of French words. There's Punjabi words that the British picked up in during the Raj. Pajamas, shampoo is a Hindi word, right? So it's just one of these things where I think it's very heartening, this idea that people, we're talking about expression and that's tied to identity. And there's something really beautiful about that, right? And then we can get to the practicality of it, as a second thing. But practically speaking, with some of the studies that you're talking about, I think that there's also an argument to say that multilingualism, it enhances probably overall cognition. It probably enhances, you learn one language. I don't know, it might even make your other language better, right? I mean, you might, now that you have different ways to think about grammar, different ways to think about sentence construction, maybe you just become smarter overall.
It's possible, I'm sure. I think for me, I can say that even when I'm learning new languages, it really does give me the opportunity to think about things differently. Whether it be that, maybe in one language there's a certain way in which syntax flows, or there's a way you can put things together, or even understanding how in some words in some languages have such deep meanings that cannot be translated. And so I think too, there are studies that show, if I'm remembering correctly, where different languages require different parts of your brain. And so that can also change the way in which you view the world and experience it. And so it's interesting to see when people move to a different place or they're learning a new language, how does that kind of go against or work in conjunction with the way in which you learned your mother tongue and learned your first language. So as you're saying, there are a lot of cognitive benefits and really an opportunity for you to just think about things differently. And I think when we're able to think about things differently, we're able to imagine and envision a different world altogether.
Well, like the words blue or azul, what are these colors that we're referring to? The blue in English blue is different from the azul in Spanish, right? Violet in English is different from purple. But if you're French, you say violette. But are you referring to purple or are you referring to violet? It depends on your frame of reference, right? I mean, it's all a spectrum. Like literally with the color example, there's a little spectrum for purplish, violety, bluey, reddy, something. And then in English, they decided, bang, it's this one. And then in French, they were like, no, it's that one. We think we're talking about the same thing, but in fact, they're different colors.
Correct. And imagine how much more of life we think about in those ways as well, that we just may not readily think of at the forefront, but it's happening all around us.
These things also get political though, don't they? Right? Like, I mean, language is inherently political, like who gets to say this is, again, the lingua franca is, I guess there's there's an organic component to it, right? It just kind of happens with, I don't know, like in the Silk Road, things get picked up, but oftentimes there's a top-down component to it too. And it's like, depending on where you are in the world, I mean, it can be extremely political, and I would imagine in the African continent, it's not dissimilar at all.
No, I'd say too, one thing that some folks can experience is this concept called asymmetric bilingualism. And essentially, the short version of it is you have person A and person B. Person A speaks their own language, person B speaks their own language. Person A learns the language of person B, but person B never learns the language of person A. So B gets to experience free writing of sorts because they can communicate and do what they need to do, and A can also communicate with them and they can communicate with A. But because you're never taking that chance or making that step to learn somebody else's language, it can cause this friction and this tension where people in group A might feel like, B is free writing, B is not trying. They are not respecting me by even making an attempt. And so I definitely concur that there's, especially in the continent, there is a lot of opportunity, there's tension. And there was something you said that I was going to connect this to, but escapes me right now, unfortunately.
This is just a brilliant free flow. And I think for me, I'm fascinated by this topic because, again, for me, I speak English, I speak Cantonese, I speak Mandarin, I speak some bad Spanish and really bad Portuguese, really bad. But it doesn't stop me from trying. My wife gets a real kick out of it because I will just try. I'll attempt. But, again, Cantonese is like when you talk about the Ga sort of, is Ga is language? Do people refer to it as a language or a dialect?
It's a language.
It's a language. Okay, so the Ga language, again, Cantonese is one of those things. First of all, people cannot exactly agree on what to call Cantonese, right? Is Cantonese a language? Is it a dialect? Again, depending on who you talk to, right? The official line is that it's a dialect, but there's over 100 million speakers of Cantonese. It's probably 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 years old. What do we call it? It's called Cantonese by most expatriate Chinese, overseas Chinese. But in mainland China, they refer to it as the Guangzhou-nese. So Canton as the city. So the city, so it's like Accra-nese, right? As opposed to Ghanaian sort of language. And that is for one reason, that there's so much intra-Cantonese diversity that there's like one township away, the variation is so much that they refuse to be labeled as Cantonese. They will say that we're speaking a version of the Guangzhou-nese that refers back there, because I guess maybe they don't want to lose some of their own distinction from their own like hyper localized dialect. So again, how we define these things, that's a whole nother subject unto itself, isn't it?
It is. And you reminded me of what I was going to say before, tying back the asymmetric bilingualism to languages being political, that it really can be deadly at the end of the day, the language that you are speaking or that you are not speaking. And I think we see that time and time again throughout history. And I think even with what you're saying right now about Cantonese, I spent some time in Hong Kong, and unfortunately, I only learned one word, Magoi, I think. Yes. But I think even when I was in Hong Kong and I had also done a bit of traveling throughout Asia, when I would hear people speak Mandarin and I would hear people speak Cantonese, I felt these are two very different languages altogether. They sound completely different. But I understand what you're saying, that some people do not feel that way. Some people would say that this is all Chinese. These are two different variations of it. And I think it's fascinating that too with language, because it can be political, it can be cultural, it's social, that folks get the opportunity to define it for themselves. But I think too, something that people don't necessarily recognize all the time is that, especially when it comes when it comes to language and dialect, I think people struggle with figuring out what is what. And I think people oftentimes think of language as being superior and dialects being subordinate, but not taking the time to really recognize that these two can ebb and flow depending on the time period. And so today, maybe this language is the language, but over time, if people are no longer speaking it and it changes, it can very easily become a dialect. And so they're not fixed positions or they're not fixed statuses. They really do have the opportunity to change as times change and as socio-cultural, political groundings change as well.
And it's important to point out that it can be deadly, right? We're not talking about politics in a bubble. This stuff can be deadly, and let's just ask the question about like code switching. In Ghana, do people intersperse English in with Ga or with Twi? I mean, we'll just be down the street and it'll be like something, go to the bank, or, gotta go to the toilet, something.
Yes, people do that. I think that's common in most languages, honestly, when people are speaking multiple languages and they're bilingual or multilingual. And I think, too, one of the people I had interviewed had said that even though Ga is his first language, he, or she, I should say, didn't know how to say mango or tomato. So they would find themselves speaking and they're saying these words in English and they're asking themselves, why do I not know how to say this word in my language? It doesn't make sense. I grew up here. All of my friends, my family, this is the language we speak. So what is happening? And I think too, there was someone I interviewed who said that her father had passed away And when she went to the funeral rites, she had to have her older sibling essentially translate for her what they were saying, because some of these words she just did not know. And of course, there are words in every language that we are not going to know, even if you are a fluent speaker. But for her, it really hit that I'm at my father's funeral and I'm not understanding exactly what's being said. And so languages carry a lot of weight. And I don't think people always recognize the weight that they are carrying with the languages they do and do not speak each and every day.
Absolutely. But I mean, it just goes to like in Australia, we have, I don't know, the politics is like America, but toned down like 99%. It's very milk toast compared to the discussion in the US. You know, one topic is, again, this sort of, I mean, would you call it dialect? Would you call it a mode of expression? But it goes to identity, is how, like, for example, the double negative, right? If you're Black, the double negative pops up as a form of identity. It's an expression, you know, can't nobody tell me, right? Something double negative. We know what you're saying. It's understood, but there are some people that might say, oh, well, that's not proper. That's syntax, or there's this or that, or something like this. But to me, I think that there's beauty in that expression. And I think that we as a society should find ways to try to nurture that. That's me. What do you think?
Sure. I think I think so. I think language also can show you history, and it can show you what people have been through. I think especially when it comes to people who have had other languages forced upon them, the ways in which they speak really do show you the journey that they've been through. So I'd say Haitian Creole, one thing that is really fun is that it's really an amalgamation of so many different languages that came together. But it's also the reality that it's a language of resistance. It's a language that people
Mm.
spoke when they were not permitted to read, they were not permitted to write. And so there's so much within it that when you're really looking and you understand, oh, okay, we have fond in this language, we have Taino words in this language as well. There's some
Mm.
Spanish, there's some French, there's some English. It all comes together. And so I think even for folks who are, I think especially speaking languages that are not respected and that are just seen as dialects in a derogatory way, I think it is even more critical that we just take an extra second and try to understand people. Because at the end of the day, I think oftentimes people are communicating in a way that is effective and they can be heard and they can be understood. And I think even the ideas of speaking in a way that is proper can be very problematic. I think one can also argue, say, American English is a version of English, sure, but it's not standard. One can argue it's not the English that is spoken in Britain, and therefore people can say that we are speaking a dialect.
Mm.
But I don't think people always think of that. And then, of course, there will be derivatives in every way because people are different. People make language what it is. They bring their own flavor, their own nuance, and they speak in a way that reflects their circumstances, where they are, where they've been. And that's not something that people should inherently be ashamed of or put down for. But I think the only way in which we're able to ensure that folks are really respected in the different ways in which they speak languages is if we first build that empathy within ourselves, but also begin to understand that there are multiple ways to get to the same destination. There are multiple ways to communicate and to understand and to be in community with one another.
Absolutely. And also to acknowledge the arbitrariness of, again,
Yes.
the rabbit ears inside of the word proper. Like, for
Yes.
example, the same person who says, oh, you can't say axe, right? You ask me a question. What is that? That's not proper. That same person will also, how do they pronounce the word like clothes iron? I-R-O-N. They actually pronounce it I-O-R-N. They flip it just the same. But for acts, you're not supposed to do it. But then for iron, you are. How does that make any sense?
I think it just goes to show that a lot of this is very arbitrary. And a lot of it doesn't make sense, unfortunately. And that's where I can't say we throw out the rule book. I can't say that at all. But I think there are tweaks that can be made.
And class plays a factor too. I mean, for sure. Like I think in Singapore, for example, they have extreme code switching. I'm sure there are other places that do code switching at a similar level, maybe the same type of level, but I've traveled a lot in my life. I've never seen a place that does it as routinely and as sort of pointedly as Singapore, right? And I have a hypothesis as to why they do that, but they'll do something, 今天我要去, you go to the park and buy and they'll throw in another word and then another, because they're operating in 3 to 4 languages. But my sense of it is that, and they will modulate it based on the present company. So if they're around English speakers, they'll drop it. They might still code switch a little bit, but they'll drop it and take it more English direction. If they're around Mandarin speakers, they'll do the same thing in the other direction. But amongst themselves, they will create essentially an on-demand code switched agglomerated language that is actually very hard to decipher if you don't come from that thing. So my sense of it is that it's almost this class symbol too, right? Especially with English, that also probably signifies, like I'm talking about people who probably have a bachelor's or above, and they're demonstrating their facility with English by lacing it into a lot of what they're saying.
I'll say that as much as language can unite people, language can also be the very tool to separate folks. And so, like you said, you're going to see it, especially when it comes to class. People like to feel like I am different. I think in human nature, there unfortunately can be this existence of us versus them. This is me, this is you, I'm different, you're not, or you are, I should say. And I think especially depending on the worldview that you're looking at, the traditions that you're rooted in, that can be cemented even more. And I think language is definitely an avenue in which you see that, in which it's a matter of how is it that you're speaking or how is it that you're not speaking? Like you said before, are you speaking in a way that is proper? Is it not proper? But also too, if you're speaking in a way that is not proper, why is it that it is bothersome? Is it because you feel that it denotes that you come from a lower socioeconomic class? Does it denote that you didn't have access to education? And I shouldn't say education, schooling, because I do find there to be a very big difference between the two. And so class, we could talk about class a lot. And I feel like even in my study, class came up a bit in understanding the ways in which people saw themselves to be a part of community versus others, and how even the way that could be rooted in the ways in which people speak the language and practice tradition and feel rooted in their culture and their identity. And so it does play a very big role.
Is it something where, like, let's talk about parents in this. Like, you've got kids, they're going through the schooling system. How do parents make sense of this in an environment where there's, as we said, there's politics, as we said, there's class, as we said, there's reasons to, be, I don't know, maybe you want your kid to have access to more, English is a medium for most, you can unlock a lot of the world's literature and so on with a facility in English, and some of the other colonial languages. You also have connections with other countries now, like in Africa, you have China and India. I've met actually quite a few Chinese South Africans, South African people who have learned Chinese. While I was in mainland China, there was a little like African town, like an African kind of in Guangzhou, where the trader hub was. And there are a lot of people learning Chinese, but as a medium of exchange. So as a parent, though, how do you make sense of this? You want to give your kid access, you want to give them the means to feel connected and to be able to draw back with their identity and their heritage. How should parents make sense of it?
I think parents want to see their kids succeed. And I think that we've also been taught as a society that you can only succeed if you speak one of these 4 or 5 colonial languages and that's it. And that's simply not true. And I think we see in countries where, English is not the medium of instruction, it's not going to be French, it's not going to be Spanish. The economy is doing fine. The people are doing fine. The people have so much richness in their lives. So it's not really a matter of you having to speak these specific languages in order to succeed. And so I think, too, when it comes to parenting, I think sometimes, too, it's about the framing and what knowledge do you have about a subject. If you're a parent who no one has ever told you that learning in your mother tongue is going to be beneficial, yes, you're going to think that, okay, my kid needs to be in this English school or this French school, and that's going to be it. If my idea and perception is that I want them to leave the country, I want them to go to university abroad, I want them to maybe even have these business opportunities within our country. And I'm not going to lie and say that having these languages in your repertoire is not powerful, because it is. Languages are a tool at the end of the day. But I think, too, it's also having communities that go in and really figure out what is it that they want for their community. Do you want your kids to be able to speak your language? Do you want them to be able to speak it at a high level? And also to just introducing families to this idea of linguistic interdependence, of being able to talk about the research in layman's terms in a way that's very digestible, so people know, yes, your kid is learning in their language, and yes, too, they can also learn this other language. We're just making sure they have a foundation in both. And I don't think many parents would be upset about their kids being able to be multilingual and to learn and to have more of the world open up to them. And so I think it's really an idea of framing and understanding and being able to sit and have conversations. And 2, there have been times in which communities have said, you know what, we want this to happen, let's see what happens. And then 20 years go by and they see this was really beneficial. Now this is something that we are going to be doing. Now we have an entire program at a university where 30 years ago, the program didn't exist because we weren't thinking in this way, but we took a chance and it worked out. And so I think parents have to bet on themselves and their kids just a little bit more when it comes to language in those regards, and not be afraid. But I say this with the caveat that I know I speak English with an American accent. And so I know that for me to advocate for these things comes with a lot of power and privilege and positionality that others do not have. And so I too argue that people have to make the decisions that they do feel are best for them. Because I have my opinions, but they're my opinions. Yes, I've conducted research that backs them up, but others are entitled to live their lives in the ways in which they desire. So there's that too.
Yeah, that's very well balanced. I mean, what do you think of the idea that demographically and just sort of where things are going, that we might as well learn the colonial language anyways because we'll take it over? Like I remember saying to a French person, like I think he was from Paris, I was just chit-chatting, and I was just saying that, yeah, by like 2050 or something like that, 95% of the world's French speakers are going to be outside of France, right? Maybe I got the number right. It's like 2075. But by some time, like even within my lifetime, the number of French speakers in France is going to be so marginal that what French people say about French is not really going to matter very much, right? I mean, like even in my lifetime, I used to take, English elocution, lessons where we enunciate, and that was even when I was a kid, my mom sent me to these speech lessons with this received pronunciation teacher. It was, even in those times, it was like, well, this could be access, or you wanted to go to Oxford or Cambridge or something like that. But if you speak with that type of accent, unless you're part of the royal family, the Windsors, you sound like an absolute muppet. It's totally like, because the UK is so small and diminished as a English, the horse has left the stable now. They don't own English anymore. It's owned by the world now, right? And that quote about bad English being the lingua franca of the world now, like, I guess I would pose that question, is the colonial distinction kind of irrelevant because the rest of the world is basically just going to take this and then remake it?
The rest of the world is going to take this and remake it. I think then it brings us back to what we were talking about earlier in the conversation. When people are remaking the languages, how are they respected? How are they received? And what are the negative connotations that are then associated, and or the positive connotations that are then associated? I think people can get confused and can start to stereotype in ways that are not productive. I think that sometimes people may, like you were saying earlier about using double negatives, depending on the ways in which you're speaking English, how people might automatically ascribe that to, okay, these are Black people. It's like, no, Blackness is a political identity. And so there are so many different types of Black people. What exactly is it that you're trying to say? Who are you exactly trying to talk about? There's nothing wrong with that. And in the fact that different people speak differently, because as I said before, it shows you history, and it shows you present day as well. I think when it comes to the idea of English being, like bad English being the world's lingua franca, I think that, as I was saying before, English has really benefited from receiving a lot of great importance throughout the years, centuries at this point. And it has become a language that many people have relied on to communicate. And so I'm sure that will continue, and that people will continue using this medium and other mediums to facilitate these conversations. But like you said, things evolve. Things change. I was just watching a video last night where this creator on Instagram, he says, to listen to him and see how far back you can go in understanding the English language. And I think maybe in his video, he goes back, I don't know, like 6 different, I can't say generations, but periods in time. And the further he gets, the more English sounds like Welsh. And it's like, oh, okay. I didn't know that this is what this language sounded like a millennia ago. But also, too, what will English sound like 1,000 years from now? People might hear us and think, what are they saying? That makes no sense. And so these things evolve at the end of the day.
Well, they do, yeah. I mean, and we're seeing it, I don't know, it's like the TH sound, the. I was taught to go out of your way to get that aspiration, that th. Mm-hmm. But as English de-Europeanizes, the is, if you speak a Asian language, you don't have the. It doesn't exist, right? So everything is da. So we went to you have very schooled, highly schooled, but they just don't have that. It's a like biomechanical thing, right? That fricative thing, you just don't do that. And I think for the African continent, the same way, you don't necessarily have that the. That's a Northern European thing to the. You don't have that. So we're losing that. It's like a vestigial thing happening in real time. It's like the word fewer. No one uses the word fewer anymore. Everything is less. I correct my kids because I'm a sort of wacky grammarian type, and I find it fun. And you know what? I tell them, listen, you can break whatever rule you want, but I still should inform you what the conventions are, right? That's how I was taught. But we're seeing it happen in real time, aren't we?
We are. And I think, as you were saying, I don't know for all of the languages spoken on the continent if that the sound really exists, but where you are will influence the way in which you're able to speak other languages. Like you said, there are just ways in which your tongue doesn't form. You don't have the muscles strengthened to make certain noises. I'm always fascinated by places in which they speak and everything sounds like a click. Because I just wonder, how are you doing this? But for the people, this is their norm. And I think they would perhaps wonder, how is it that you cannot do this? And I think, too, even in trying to speak Ga, or sometimes in speaking Creole, I know sometimes my family, they can hear my accent under the language that I'm speaking. And I think it's fascinating because even if I'm fluent in this language, you'll always hear the accent. It's not something that I can get rid of necessarily. And so these things, they can be really fun to get into the nitty gritty of, but like we were saying, they also have real consequences in life, and in the way that you're perceived, and the way that you're understood, and the ways in which they help to change the language at the end of the day and help it evolve into its next form.
And that's where I think this moment with these AI models, the large, language models, there are a lot of decisions that are probably being made, as we said, real time, in terms of how you set these machines to define certain things, right? I mean, it does fewer make it in there. Is it going to correct someone when they say there's less people attending the lecture? Or is it going to pop up and say, no, actually it's wrong. It's going to say, you should say fewer. It's going to correct you. I don't know if Grammarly makes that correction. I think I'm with you that I think it should be more organic and more grassroots. But I think that we're in a moment now where a lot of this is happening top down.
Yes, a lot of it is happening top down. And I think, too, I am a firm believer in bottom up approaches. What is it that the people want? What is it that the community want? How is it that we can build and coalesce at this level and bring it up and make this something bigger and larger? I was chatting with someone who was working on teaching students Ga. I believe they were creating teaching materials. And they said that they were working with teachers from various parts of Accra, which is the Ga people's ancestral land. And they were realizing, this one word is said a little differently depending on which part of town you live in. So how do we standardize this for people to learn, and for us to say, okay, this, when we're in the classroom, this is what the word is or how it's pronounced. And so I think I speak Haitian Creole, and I was talking with someone who is Cameroonian. They speak French, and we were speaking a bit in French, and I pronounced something in a way where they said, the way you've pronounced that, I know that you're Haitian. And I said, oh, I see. I'm glad that my language is helping people to identify me. But yeah, it's not at the forefront of your mind, but it's definitely impacting things.
Yeah, it definitely is. As part of my journey in vanilla, and growing organic vanilla, I've had this realization that, again, the Australian continent is very large. We happen to, however, be in this little tropical slice of it. And it's funny how that somehow reframes your thinking, in terms of the centrism, like rather than feeling more connected with the rest of the continent, it's funny because I feel like climatically much more connected with the equatorial belt, right? Because we're growing vanilla and we're very hypersensitive to the microclimate. We're hypersensitive to humidity. We're hypersensitive to, drainage, and we like rain. We like heat and we like rain. We're happy with humidity. The orchids thrive in those conditions. So one place where they do grow vanilla is Ghana. Ghana, I got an email from someone from Uganda yesterday talking about growing vanilla in Uganda's East Africa, but it's kind of Central Africa, I guess, right? It's East-ish, right? One thing I'd really like a sort of dream I have is to do like a vanilla tour of the world. To do like Indonesia, do like different parts of Asia, and then Africa would be a huge part of it. And Ghana grows some great, it was called the Gold Coast. It's like unbelievably fertile. They grow, there's huge mineral wealth, but beautiful vanilla, beautiful coffee. So it's definitely on the list. I'd love to make this like a vanilla tour.
I think that's a really fun idea. I think it would be lovely to see, especially, what does the vanilla also taste like in all of these different places?
Exactly. And
Yes.
and I just wonder, and because like with the Africana Center, I saw one of the Tufts videos, I think, that was recent, right? Where you talked about one of the study tours that's upcoming to Ghana, hosted by the university.
Yes,
right?
yes. As part of the university's Travel and Learn program, there is going to be a trip to Ghana in April of 2026. I will be the staff host, so definitely that could be a wonderful opportunity to meet you in person. And so, I believe we'll be spending 7, 8 days just traversing and going through, and people will be learning. It is going to be an educational trip as well. And so there'll be opportunities to go and see castles, to go and for people, they may want to get named as well, and also just learn more about the history of the country, and then also learn more about the linguistic landscape of the country and what language has really done in the space.
That's so cool. So I wanted to mention that because, again, I have this, I don't know how I can pull it off to do this thing. And I'd like to somehow, obviously I have to film it sort of documentary type style. I don't know if there's some sponsor or funding, but it might be, if I get the concept a little bit more fleshed out, it'd be really fun to talk about it because a lot about, again, we've had a great conversation about the linguistic, the sort of cultural identity elements, but just the actual visiting such a cool place. You've been there many times. And again, if I can tie it in with some educational cultural stuff, or potentially, I don't know, maybe even link up with the university or something to do with agriculture, I'd be really keen to do that.
I think it's a really fascinating opportunity, and I think too, Ghana is a place that I recommend folks to visit simply because the people are so welcoming and so kind, and there's just so much to learn from the place. And I think too, especially with vanilla, I think there's a real opportunity to connect with those who are in agriculture in particular, and to learn about the methods that they're using. And I think I can see what you're saying in my head. I think it'd be great to do a tour between the different places, see the similarities, see the differences. What's the taste? What's the smell? What is the connection of vanilla to this place as well? Because I, at least in the cuisine that I'm most familiar with in Ghana, vanilla it doesn't come up as much. Or maybe it just doesn't come up in my family recipes, but it's not at the forefront of my mind the way in which I think of vanilla when I think of Haiti.
Haiti's got to be on there. Yes, for sure. I should be asking you about Haiti because that's the other side of your background. I mean, Haiti, and again, the Creole stuff is so interesting. And you mentioned that I didn't even pick up on that about the sort of language of resistance, right? Like it's actually by design that it's supposed to be unintelligible, right? Because they wanted to distinguish themselves in a way from the French, right?
This is an interesting point. I don't know if it's intentional to be unintelligible to French. I think it's a product of circumstance for sure. And I think too that to an extent it can't be mutually intelligible because it truly just is a completely different language. It has its own syntax, it has its own structure. Right now I'm taking a French class and I was just telling someone that I couldn't remember the article for tea in French, if it was feminine, if it was masculine. And so I was thinking of it in Creole because the word is the same. But any sentence I came up with, I said, oh, we don't mention an article in this language. And so it's different. There are similarities, but it's different. And I think a lot of people can just think of it as, oh, it's a dialect or this is broken French. It's like, no, that's not the case. I also personally don't believe in languages being broken as well. I believe that they are just different and they exist in a different sphere. But yeah.
It's a brilliant topic, and through the podcast, I've been fortunate to talk to some indigenous folks, and it's so interesting when you come from an oral history, like the intensity of the language is so much higher. Like when you have an oral language, you remember things. Like there's so much more power with the words. I come from a like literary written language. It's a little bit different. And it's almost like forecasting the world today where everything is ChatGPT. Like students, no one knows anything. We're just like vessels for asking prompts now, right? But if you're from an oral tradition, it's like, no, I actually remember how to get to a place that's 1,000 kilometers away because there's 5 songs that I know how to recite in order. And I remember the tone. And then there's like 5 mountain passes that are referenced in the second verse. I mean, all of that information contained inside of this oral tradition. We are like, okay, well, we're better because we've written it down. But at the same time, what is our ability to recall and actually make use of that into information?
It's true. It's true. And I think especially when it comes to languages that have this strong oral history, there is such a preservation of memory that takes place as well. And I think we've been taught in the West that to remember means you must write it. But I think in other traditions, to remember can mean that you feel it, that you understand it, that it's intrinsic, that it's in how you speak, it's in how you pause, it's in how you take your time. And you miss those nuances when the focus is simply write it down, write it down, write it down, instead of experiencing and embodying. Those are very different things. And I think too, there's a way in which sometimes when you come from an oral tradition or in a case in which writing physically is not necessarily of the utmost importance, there's a way I think in which you understand your words as well. And I think you also have a greater understanding at times of the power that words hold and the ways in which they can be used and they cannot be used, and how I can speak, as we were talking about code switching earlier, I can speak with this group of people in this particular way, but I can't do that with others. And I think when you have it in the literary form, I think one of the ways we see that is when people are writing for academia and it seems, even if there's not a paywall, like it's behind a wall. It's a different language. It's not necessarily meant all the time for everyone to understand because you're competing and ensuring that I've cited this person, I've cited that person, I've said it in this way, instead of just saying it in a way that is like 10 times more simpler, just so people can read it and grasp it and not going in this lofty circle. I say this knowing full well that I do like a lofty sentence, so no one should say anything. That is true. That is true. But yeah,
That's So well put. That is so well put. I really resonate with that. Again, if the university there's a connection to Australia, somehow it pops up, study something like this. We're offering retreats and things like that at the vanilla plantation. So you're welcome anytime. I really have so much fondness for Tufts, Tufts, and for the sort of jumbo Fletcher Mafia, and let me flesh this out a little bit more about this vanilla tour and tying it in with Ghana. But you've really inspired me to learn more about Ghana. There's just so much more that it's fascinating. It's exciting, and there's so much happening in the continent. I hope we can continue some dialogue about it.
Yes, that would be lovely. I'm always happy to chat and help people figure out, how is it that you connect and get to where you want to be. So more than happy to always hop on another call.
Yeah, definitely. It's a real pleasure, Kella. It's a real pleasure. Really, I really enjoyed this conversation.
Likewise.
All right, thank you, Kella. Take care.
Have a good one.
Right, you
Bye-bye.
too.